Welcome to meeting number 26 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on February 12, 2026, the committee is meeting on the situation in Venezuela. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format. I've spoken about the logistics around that, so I'll skip that. But for the benefit of the witnesses and members, please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. For those on Zoom, at the bottom of your screen, you can select the appropriate channel for interpretation, either floor, English, or French. And for those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. I would now like to welcome our witnesses. As an individual, Daniel DiMartino, fellow Manhattan Institute, joining us today by video conference. Dr. Robert Johnston, Director of Energy and Natural Resources Policy, School of Public Policy, University of Calgary, by video conference as well. From the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Kristin Halvorsen, Acting Representative in Venezuela, by video conference. And from the International Crisis Group, we have Elizabeth Dinkinson, Deputy Director, Latin America, by video conference. I'd like to thank the witnesses for their availability and flexibility. Earlier today, a decision was made to bring all the witnesses together in a single panel for the full 2 hours of the meeting, but we understand that some of you may need to leave before the end of the meeting due to prior commitments. For example, Dr. Johnston around 4:30 and Ms. Dinkinson around 4:45 p.m. I also understand that there is consensus among colleagues that will probably proceed for up to an hour and a half as opposed to the full 2 hours. Up to 5 minutes will be given for opening remarks, after which we will proceed with rounds of questions from members of the committee. I now invite Ms. Halvorsen to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes.
Thank you. I would like to start by saying that UNHCR has worked in Venezuela for more than 35 years, earning the trust of communities and accompanying them through the major shifts in the country's recent history. Venezuela has long been a host country for refugees and migrants, and currently a significant number of individuals are returning with the intention of reintegrating. This trend requires tailored support. Throughout these changes, UNHCR has continued working directly with people on the move and with communities that are exposed to protection risks. The office supports access to essential services and strengthens community coping capacities, complementing the efforts of the local authorities. Through community-based approaches, UNHCR works with communities and stakeholders to identify barriers, promote inclusion, and facilitate referral to state services. In this dialogue with the committee, UNHCR would like to present needs and risks. Current dynamics are marked by contrasts. Communities continue to face ongoing socioeconomic constraints. This influences their access to healthcare, education, documentation, and social programs, even as some areas experience economic recovery. Other challenges include situations described as pressure or restrictive practices by various groups. Youth, small traders, and those without documentation are particularly affected. Community structures also identify a high demand for psychosocial support, and 93% refer to this as a priority need in their community. Despite these pressures, the situation remains relatively calm. No major new outward movements have been observed. Monitoring instead shows a steady trend of returns, internal relocations, and short-term cross-border mobility. In 2025-26, 59% of monitored individuals were returning to Venezuela and 41% were departing. The returnees that UNHCR engages with in Venezuela express a combination of hope and caution regarding their reintegration process. The drivers of return include family reunification, reduced opportunities, and integration barriers in their host countries. There are also expectations of improving conditions in Venezuela. Although most returnees wish to remain in the country, they do encounter some challenges, especially in areas that have been very much affected by issues of mobility. The area of returns is an area where UNHCR seeks to collaborate with the state and support the initiatives of the government in line with its mandate. The organization is preparing to support the voluntary returns from host countries as well as in the reception and reintegration inside of Venezuela. At the same time, it should be noted that many Venezuelans abroad are likely to remain in their country of asylum or host country. Therefore, it will be necessary to support regularization, residency pathways, naturalization, and access to national protection systems. The regional efforts for protection assistance and integration are supported through the Regional Interagency Coordination Platform for Refugees and Migrants, the R4V. This initiative is co-led by IOM and UNHCR. Overall, Venezuela's protection environment continues to be influenced by diverse overlapping dynamics. UNHCR's response prioritizes protection services, legal assistance, and strengthened referral pathways. This is done through multi-service bases in key locations. UNHCR stands ready to scale up activities as part of a state-led response. Finally, in this context, UNHCR deeply appreciates the long-standing support of the Government of Canada and the members of Parliament from all parties who have consistently advocated for meeting the humanitarian needs of Venezuelans. Continued Canadian humanitarian leadership remains vital. UNHCR recognizes Canada's critical role as a donor in sustaining protection assistance and integration efforts for Venezuelans throughout the region, and possibly for the reception and reintegration of those who want to return to the country. Therefore, UNHCR encourages Canada to maintain and, wherever possible, expand its support. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now invite Ms. Dinkinson to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes.
Thank you very much again for the invitation, and good afternoon from Bogota. I am the Deputy Director for Latin America here at International Crisis Group. It is a field-based organization focusing on investigations into conflict and armed violence. And I would like to focus my comments specifically on risks going forward in that regard in Venezuela in the months ahead. I want to start with a message that I hope I can leave you with here today, which is that essentially what has happened since the 3rd of January is a pivot in the existing regime in Venezuela toward U.S. alignment, but without changing the fundamentals of the system behind it. And interestingly, there have been, for example, no apparent fractures within the security apparatus. Despite avoiding, I think, some of the risks that many of us feared in terms of a regime change situation that could have led to devastating instability and conflict, those risks have so far been avoided. However, there is still a fundamental conflict at the heart of the situation in Venezuela between the government and other sectors of civil society and the political space that will have to be resolved in order to move forward towards a transition and ultimately through much needed security sector reform. I want to focus now particularly on one of those specific security threats that we see as a possible challenge coming forward, and that has to do with the presence of armed and criminal groups throughout Venezuela, particularly in the extractive sectors. For example, the control and utilization of the mining sector for illicit enrichment. And here I will speak specifically about the Colombian insurgent group National Liberation Army, also known as ELN, which I think for some time now, really up to a decade, has been establishing a very significant presence on both sides of the border of Colombia and Venezuela. We understand today that ELN's fighters may be up to half of their capacity inside of Venezuela. And prior to the January 3rd operation, the ELN enjoyed a bit of political cover from Caracas, essentially a live and let live relationship in which the presence of both supported one another. That meant that the ELN enjoyed safe haven in Venezuela, the capability to arm offensive operations against the Colombian state, but also access to key illicit income, for example, through the trafficking of not only drugs, but also legal products, as well as the exploitation of mines. Those relationships with the Venezuelan government were fundamental to facilitating that business at a high level, but more importantly, at a lower level, in which security forces from the Venezuelan state were complicit and enriched themselves through payments from illicit economy as products moved through Venezuelan territory. Let me talk about specifically those dynamics. The ELN has positioned itself as the de facto control authority in particularly rural and southern communities in Venezuela and Amazonas states, and in the mineral arc that is home to not only gold deposits, but also rare earth minerals. In this context, the ELN employs a number of human rights violations, for example, forced labor, including of children, and exercises really quite brutal control over communities in mining areas, also contributing to significant environmental damage, for example, through the use of mercury to extract gold. A key facilitating factor of the ELN's ability to operate in mining areas and to benefit from them is this complicity from Venezuelan security forces, who receive a percentage of the income that is extracted from these industries. I think the question for all of us now is how and if this will change now in the new current political context. And I think what we have seen so far are a few things. First of all, potentially there could be a repositioning at a high level. The relationships that existed between Caracas and criminal groups, including the ELN, may start to see a decoupling, primarily because of the risks that the armed group sees in terms of the relationship between Washington and Caracas. But at a low level, I think the dynamics are likely to continue for some time at a sort of business as usual level. And here I want to make a key point, which is that it is fundamental for the cohesion of the security forces that this illicit income continues to flow. One of the reasons I believe that we have not seen fractures in the security forces is because illicit income continues to grease the wheels of this chain of command, incentivizing members of the security forces to remain in their positions and benefit from the illicit income that is still happening. The ELN and other armed and criminal groups, I think, will try to carve out their interests strategically in Venezuela. In the case of ELN, we can expect that to involve three geographic areas. First, the border between Colombia and Venezuela, which is for them a fundamental trafficking corridor and also a safe haven. Second, the mining areas in the mineral arc, which could pose a challenge, particularly if there are Western interests in entering the mining sector there. And third of all, potentially in the southern areas of the Venezuelan Amazon, where armed and criminal groups are increasingly seeking refuge. The last point I want to make here is that I do think that the operation in January is likely to radicalize these organizations, empower their recruiting potential, drawing on narratives of anti-imperialism, and limit the possibilities for peace negotiations in the short term.
Thank you very much for your remarks. I now invite Dr. Robert Johnston to make an opening statement.
Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in the hearing this afternoon. I'm pleased to represent the University of Calgary School of Public Policy and Haskayne School of Business. I have 25 years of experience as an analyst of global energy geopolitics at Eurasia Group and at the Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy. Venezuelan energy has been a consistent area of focus throughout this time.
Sorry, Dr. Johnston, could you lower your mic closer to your mouth? Yeah.
Is that better?
Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you. Yes, my perspective and expertise focus on the energy market, particularly the oil market and refined petroleum product markets, which are very significant factors in the outlook for Venezuela. I would like to make 3 points in my opening comments today. The first point is that Venezuela's oil sector recovery is very closely linked to global oil market conditions. This involves the overall level of spending across all oil and gas investment and where Venezuela sits from a competitiveness perspective versus other upstream opportunities around the world, including Canada, the US, and elsewhere. This is important because the Venezuelan government and its national oil company lack the financial and technical resources that countries like Saudi Arabia or Norway have to develop their own resources directly without reliance on international investors. Now, I think despite the current situation with high oil prices and uncertainty in the Straits of Hormuz, overall, the upstream oil and gas investment is much weaker than it was 25 years ago during the high water period of Venezuelan oil production around the time the Hugo Chavez government took office. Industry's appetite for frontier-type investment, high-risk investments, is much lower, and there's a preference for U.S. shale and other projects like the oil sands and deep water that are a little bit lower risk. So this reduces the possibility that Venezuela will be able to increase its production from the current 1 million barrels a day or so up to 3.5 million barrels a day level that it had in the late 1990s. Second major point, the private sector and the capital markets are not the only factor here. There's also the question of U.S. government commitment to rebuilding Venezuela's oil sector, which is linked closely to its not just its strategy for Venezuela, but its larger national security strategy towards the Western Hemisphere. The point is that Venezuela's oil sector recovery is unlikely to be just left to the free market alone. The Trump administration will likely provide risk guarantees, low-cost capital, and even some form of physical security to oil companies re-entering Venezuela. Now, whether that's enough to trigger new foreign investment remains to be seen. The Trump administration likely views Venezuela as a long-term oil resource for U.S. markets. They also will see oil as the key to consolidating a new U.S.-friendly successor government to Maduro. And they certainly want to avoid a scenario where Russia and China regain influence, or as other experts have discussed here, the country descends into some kind of unrest due to a lack of basic services. Oil is a factor that can help mitigate all of those risks from a U.S. perspective. So notwithstanding geopolitical entanglements in other parts of the world, the Trump administration will try to deliver the necessary conditions for an oil recovery in Venezuela: capital, security, labor, materials, and importantly, trying to create a stable, recognized government that can both implement and uphold the rule of law around petroleum. A very tall order overall, but one that Canada should watch closely. Lastly, for Canada specifically, a potential uplift in Venezuelan production is significant. An additional 500,000 to 1 million barrels a day of oil production from Venezuela will change the prices we receive for our oil on the U.S. Gulf Coast. And it would also change the business case for a project like Keystone XL, which would build deeper links between Alberta and the U.S. Gulf Coast. It would not eliminate the case for that project entirely, but it would change the economics. At the same time, however, a reduced flow of Venezuelan barrels to Asia will also increase demand in that market for Canadian heavy oil. And that's further exacerbated by disruptions in heavy oil from countries like Saudi Arabia and Iraq right now. So as such, efforts by the provincial and federal governments to pursue additional West Coast pipeline and export capacity appear well-founded. Thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts, and I look forward to your questions.
Much for your remarks. We'll next go to Mr. DiMartino to make an opening statement.
Thank you, Chair and members. Thank you for the invitation to appear before your committee. My name is Daniel DiMartino, and I was born in Venezuela in 1999, the same year that Hugo Chavez came to power. I left Venezuela in 2016 for the United States, where I now work as a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and I am a PhD candidate in economics at Columbia University. Venezuela's crisis was caused by an ideological project, the destruction of economic liberty, private property, and democratic institutions brought about by socialism. That project began when Hugo Chavez took office in 1999. He promised dignity for the poor, sovereignty for our nation by redistributing the wealth from the rich and the oil industry. To do this, he concentrated power in the executive branch and the federal government. He imposed price controls, nationalized private companies, large and small, from farms to banks, manufacturing, and he took over the central bank to expand the money supply and finance his excessive welfare programs. Under Chavez and his handpicked successor, Maduro, the state expanded by hiring additional hundreds of thousands of public workers, pulling them out of the private economy and making more people dependent on the state, which was the goal. When their popularity sank, the elections were rigged. Democratic socialism was voted into power, but could not be voted out of power. These socialist policies caused hyperinflation, shortages, crime, blackouts, water shortages, things that I experienced myself. And now nearly 9 million Venezuelans have left the country. This is the largest refugee crisis in the planet. It's larger than Syria's or Ukraine's, and it's the largest peacetime refugee crisis in human history. Socialism forced more people to flee than most wars in human history. Venezuela, though, was not destined to fail, but to succeed. It was, for much of the 20th century, a country of immigrants and opportunity with freedom and the largest oil reserves in the world. My own grandparents went there from Europe in 1956 because Venezuela had freedom and opportunity with upward mobility. That history is one reason the Venezuelan tragedy is so important for us, because it was not a desperate and uneducated failed state. It was a functioning society dismantled by socialism. And when the regime destroyed the oil industry, it turned to the sure source of revenue of every criminal, drug trafficking. Now Venezuela is not just a socialist regime, but a narco regime that finances its client structure to keep power through drug trafficking and other illicit activities. After the rigged 2024 presidential election, my friend Maria Oropesa, who was scheduled to appear in this committee, was unjustly imprisoned for 18 months in a torture center, only to be released this year thanks to the U.S. arrest of Nicolas Maduro. This is just one of the many reasons I strongly supported President Donald Trump's January 3rd military law enforcement operation that led to the arrest of Nicolas Maduro. This was not just a lawful operation, it was a just one. Maduro was not a head of state presiding over a legitimate order, as the Canadian government didn't recognize him either. He was the head of a narco regime that destroyed Venezuela's democracy and turned it into a source of drugs for Europe, Canada, and the United States, and an ally of the enemies of freedom, including China, Russia, and Iran. Most Venezuelans, according to all credible polls, supported the U.S. intervention and are hopeful for the future and want the rest of the regime out of power. Several positive things have happened since Maduro's removal. First, the regime's aura of permanence has been shattered. For years, Venezuelans were told that this could never end, and, with force it did. That psychological barrier was broken. Second, political prisoners have begun to be released, and though the process is incomplete, it is ongoing. And third, there is increased media freedom, with private channels such as Venevisión airing criticism of the regime and praise for the United States. Finally, the economy is improving thanks to renewed interest of foreign investors brought about by the deregulation and privatization that the Trump administration is forcing on the remnants of the regime. But I want to finish by saying that there are still risks. The first and really most important risk is that the regime survives without Maduro. Their goal is to lengthen the transition enough to outlast the Trump administration in the United States, because they know that only this American president is willing to use force against them. That is why I encourage you as Canada's government to insist on the full political liberalization and preparations for free general elections, as well as the release of all political prisoners. You should even try to be observers in those elections. I want to finish by thanking you and letting you know that Venezuela is a warning to all free nations that socialism can be voted in, but not voted out. And I pray that once Venezuela becomes a free country again, and it is a beacon of freedom, countries like Canada and Venezuela can prosper through trade and exchange together. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your remarks. I will now open the floor for questions. beginning with MP Michael Chong. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for appearing. My first question concerns the transition, I should say. As we understand it, the U.S. administration is looking at eventually a 3-part plan, the third of which is a transition to democracy. What are your views on the role that Mr. Gonzalez and Ms. Machado should play in that democratic transition? And why don't we just start with Ms. Halverson?
As I am here representing UNHCR, which is a humanitarian organization, and we are both humanitarian
That's
and
fine.
apolitical, I would rather not comment
so-
on this and would invite
Okay.
the rest of the panel.
Thank you. Would the other panelists care to comment if they can?
I would be happy to comment.
Sure.
Yes. Look, Maria Corina Machado is indisputably a great woman and admired leader, somebody I support, that if there were elections today, I would vote for her as a Venezuelan. And I think that that's her role. The role should be that we should make preparations for a free election. That's going to take time because turns out most of the country is not even registered to vote. The voter rolls are all tainted. So all that preparation needs to happen. And I think she should run for president, and I think she would win in a landslide. I think that's the role.
Okay, I appreciate that answer. Do any of the other two of you have a view on this? Yeah, go ahead, Ms. Dickinson.
Sure. I think, I think one of the fundamental issues that would be necessary to secure the conditions for a transition is this political dialogue, really, between the government and all sectors of the opposition and civil society. I think we are very concerned that a rapid transition to democracy or a rapid fire shift from one ruling regime to another could really destabilize the system and unravel the stability of the country in a way that could undermine democracy going forward. Our view is that we need to begin with dialogue to establish the conditions for what it would look like to have a transition. For example, the members of the security forces who are implicated in human rights violations, how would we eliminate those individuals, give them a chance to be investigated fairly, and to also provide witness and testimony for their own crimes in a way that would allow the institutions to persist while a transition would be taking place.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Dr. Johnson, do you have any view on this?
No, I would agree with Elizabeth. I think she summed it up very well.
Okay,
Rapid transition has gone off the rails in other countries, so it's worth watching here.
Okay. I have a question, Dr. Johnson, for you specifically. In our last meeting, we were talking about whether or not Canadian expertise could be used to help Venezuela rebuild its oil industry. And there's the whole issue of sanctions that are presently in place that make it impossible for some people to work with other people in Venezuela. But I want to ask you more broadly something else that came up about geopolitics. You mentioned that one of the consequences of this U.S. action in Venezuela is that it likely will diminish the price that Canadian oil exporters get on the southern Gulf Coast of the United States, but increase demand from the West Coast because of Chinese demand. So could you maybe elaborate a bit more on how that dynamic might play out?
Sure, yeah, and as you can imagine, there's many variables that go into that assessment. Starting with the Gulf Coast, I think right now we would expect maybe up to 500,000 or 600,000 barrels a day of supply that used to go to China start showing up more consistently in the U.S. That would be larger than the amount of Canadian oil that currently goes to the Gulf Coast as opposed to the Midwest. So it's not that we'd lose market share, it's just that the prices might weaken a little bit for Canada in that scenario. In the high case for Venezuela, then there's a risk that we could lose market share in the Gulf Coast and that our barrels would need to go to other markets like Asia. I think on the Asian side, yes, the events in Venezuela, the events in Iran, certainly reinforce appetite for oil diversity and market hedging, I guess we would say, in the Asian markets, particularly in China and India and Korea, because those are the three countries that have the heavy conversion refineries, similar to what exists in the U.S. Gulf Coast, that can process the Canadian heavy oil or the Venezuelan heavy oil. All three countries have fairly strong demand growth, particularly China and India.
Quick question for you. I've only got a little time left. If Canadian oil demand, if Chinese oil demand, if Chinese demand for Canadian oil increases substantially over the coming years, does that give us net leverage in our relationship with the People's Republic of China, or does it expose us to net vulnerabilities?
Well, I think both sides, China and Canada, would have a strong incentive to maintain diversification. We would not want to replace our current dependence on the U.S. with new dependence on China, and similarly, the Chinese would not want to become overly dependent on Canada in the case that there was some disruption with the U.S. But that still leaves plenty of room for us to send them, say, 500,000 barrels a day in the context of a market where they consume 16 million and we produce 5 million.
Thank you very much. We go next to MP Mona Fortier. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for all of you coming today to our committee. My questions will be mostly for Kristen Holverson as the representative for UNHCR. And I just wanted to start by saying I'm pretty impressed by the work that you've been doing and the wealth of experience and expertise that you have and you can bring, I believe, to the committee. I'm going to go with different questions, and feel free to answer with the, if you can. Have you noticed a difference in migration patterns since the U.S. intervention?
No, thank you so much for that question. We have not. What we've seen consistently over the last 3 years is that people have been coming back in growing numbers. So 3 years ago, if we interviewed 10 people, 7 would be leaving the country and 3 would be coming back. Now that ratio is almost inverted. And that trend has remained also after the 3rd of January.
And more specifically, would the reasons coming back would be for which reasons? If you can maybe explain to the committee, what are economic reasons, those coming back because they want to be a part of Venezuela's next steps? Please, maybe if you hear anything about what they...
Yes. What we hear from people is that the main reason is about family reunification. And then there's an issue of people having been abroad for a long time. So they have maybe tried to integrate in their host country. They have not been very successful in that. So now they see a hope for economic recovery in Venezuela, and they think that they will be better off in Venezuela. But as always, you know, it's a complex number of reasons that compel people to move. But yes, we do hear also, for us, it's interesting that people, when they come back, increasingly are referring that they want to stay. They wish to now remain in Venezuela. So that is also an upward trend that we've been measuring over the last years, now up to 85% expressing that they would want to remain in Venezuela if basic conditions are met. So that's very interesting for us. And that also means that we need to really tailor responses, both to respond to those people who, for different reasons, want to remain in their host countries and those who now wish to return.
And with the answer that you just gave, I think it gives an introduction to my next question. With the current situation unfolding, what should or can Canada do to continue to support UNHCR's efforts and or Canada's humanitarian assistance to the Venezuelan people?
Yes, so there will still be a need for really different kinds of interventions, both in the host countries. There will have to be support for people to be able to naturalize, if that's an opportunity, to at least have documents, ID documents in order. Probably also some work in terms of labor inclusion. And those things are very much the same for Venezuela, to be honest, because we see that when people come back, they might come with children who were born abroad. So they probably will need access to late birth registration, or other ID documents. So all that can be done in terms of helping us support these responses would be very welcome. And there's also, as we said, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, there's this consistent need for psychosocial support that communities themselves identify. So this is also something that would be very much needed to ensure that those who do come back can reintegrate in the best manner possible.
And how are you working with neighboring governments or organizations? And if so, what are you doing with them? How is it coordinated?
Yeah, so UNHCR has offices, of course, here in Venezuela, but also in Colombia and in Brazil, which would be the immediate neighboring countries. And we, of course, also have a response across the region. So that means that it's mainly the representation in that country that will speak to the government. So we do coordinate with our colleagues, and we have discussions with them to be able to identify trends and movement. That much said, of course, in a situation where people might want to be able to come back to Venezuela, we would engage in tripartite agreements where both the host country, the country of origin, and UNHCR would work together to ensure that these returns can take place in a voluntary, informed, and safe manner. So that would be a way. And then finally, and this is for the overall coordination in the region, of course, all these governments are working together through the R4B platform.
Thank you very much. We go next to MP Duceppe. You have 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, witnesses. Thank you for being here today with us for this important study. I'd like to start with Ms. Dickinson. I would like to know about the analysis that your organization conducted on the military operation that dethroned or got Nicolas Maduro out of power.
So our organization mostly focuses on internal conflict and armed group dynamics. So we don't have any particular analysis of the actual operation that took place. I don't know if there's a particular focus that you have in mind in terms of its impact on the ground or the sort of international law perspective.
Yes, it is more with relation to the consequences internally on the ground. What was the impact there on internal policies, but also on the situation, the security situation that is afoot in Venezuela?
Yes, exactly. Okay. So in terms of the internal situation, it was an interesting operation because essentially what happened was the figurehead of the regime, which we can think about as an ecosystem with various centers of power. The figurehead was removed, but essentially that ecosystem of power that is divided between different individuals within the government remains intact and largely unchanged. And one of the interesting things that we have seen is the cohesiveness of particularly the security sector to stay on board, even as some very significant reforms, particularly economic reforms, have been made. I think we would salute certainly the release of political prisoners, the creation of a reconciliation committee. I think there are positive steps. Of course, we need to see more. Of course, we would all love for that to be faster. But I do think that the sort of attentiveness to the security case situation is vital. Now, outside of Caracas, I think that the security situation remains extremely volatile. And, as I mentioned, armed and criminal groups, for example, the ELN, are clinging hard to their economic interests throughout the country, particularly in the mining sector, but also in trafficking. And addressing those security concerns is probably a very long-term situation because essentially the security arrangement that has been in place for now years has been for Caracas to essentially outsource controlling governments of certain areas of the country, particularly in rural areas, to non-state actors. And those groups exercise control, they impose rules on the community, they run the economy, and they are essentially those who are governing. And rolling back that scenario, I think, will take some time. In the meantime, I think we do need to also be attentive about the potential for criminal organizations to try to take advantage of the situation and the changes in Caracas, for example, expanding their control or moving into new illicit economies.
Et vous avez parlé d'une possible
You mentioned a potential radicalization of groups like the ELN, for example, that could become more and more radicalized. But I'm also curious about the territories that are currently controlled by the ELN and where the ELN is extracting rare earth minerals and gold, for example. What markets are those products being sent to? Are they making their way to Western markets, or is it the immediate neighbors of Venezuela that are getting those products?
Absolutely. So let me start with that part about the trafficking of these illicit minerals. So there are several ways that these armed groups work, again, in collaboration, really, and complicity with the Venezuelan security forces. The first is that these minerals are essentially sold to the state mining company. And from there, they are exported to the countries that Venezuela exports the largest amount of gold to. Previously, this included China, but also countries in the Middle East and elsewhere. The other way that these minerals are essentially extracted and moved it back into the legal supply chain is through the border with Colombia. And this is one of the many reasons that for groups like the ELN, control of this border area is fundamental. For example, in the case of coltan and other critical minerals, these minerals are moved across the border from Amazonas state into Vichada in Colombia, where they are essentially registered as if they were extracted in Colombia and then exported through a legal process, in many cases to China, but also to other buyers as well.
OK. Et donc il n'y a pas nécessairement de...
So there is not necessarily an American or U.S. private company that's involved in that supply chain. I just want to clarify that.
No, we are not aware of any. However, because of the expressions of interest from the United States, we now have companies who are raising their voices and sort of raising their hands and saying we might be interested in coming back in. That's particularly the case of companies who had their assets expropriated when the mineral sector, like the oil sector, was nationalized some years ago.
Oh, pardon. Merci beaucoup, Madame Dickinson.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dickinson. Ms. Halverson, you were saying that there are a number of people coming back out of the 7.9 million refugees, and someone else, another witness, said that the refugee crisis in Venezuela is one of the biggest on the planet, basically. And so you're saying that people are coming back to Venezuela. Is there a particular country that these people are returning from, or is it from a number of places?
Thank you. So in summary, people are returning from several countries. Of course, the last country that they return from tend to be Colombia in terms of having a joint border, but we do have registration of people coming back from Chile, Peru, Ecuador, and also as policies changed in the United States, we had people who had gone up through the Darien jungle who then had reached Mexico, and after those changes decided to come back. So we do have return movements from the whole region.
Thank you very much. Next, we have questions from MP Ziad Abul Taif. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for the witnesses. Dr. Johnson, you mentioned that the United States policy when it comes to the Venezuelan oil is on a long-term reserve rather than a current supply. Is that true?
They have made public statements suggesting that it could have both short-term value and longer-term value. But I think in the current moment when U.S. oil production is at record highs and they're still seeing a lot of investment in the shale oil in Texas in particular, the immediate need for that oil is less. Now, of course, things keep changing and we have the crisis in Iran, but the Venezuelan oil production increase is not going to be enough to displace the 15 or 20 million barrels a day of supply being disrupted in Iran. So I think ultimately this is a more about medium-term and long-term option value for the U.S. and, of course, keeping the resource out of the hands of the Russians and Chinese.
Thanks for the clarification. What is the current capacity of oil production in Venezuela at the moment?
It's been fluctuating up to about 1 million barrels a day, and that's mostly through projects that have been producing so-called extra heavy oil, where they've had to import condensate and light oil from other countries to try to blend and sell that into the market. Until they get their big upgraders fixed to produce more synthetic crude oil, that's going to be a big limit on how much more they can produce beyond that 1 million barrel a day level. So the next level of growth will take a lot more investment, a lot more time.
It will be nice to know the equipment that used by the oil industry in Venezuela. Is it American equipment? Is it European equipment? Do we know?
Yeah, look, I think if you go back to the 1990s, the 5 major Venezuela Orinoco projects, heavy oil projects, were all U.S. and European companies, and they used U.S., Canadian, and European technology. The process of upgrading extra heavy, almost solid oil into lighter oil was all built by the super majors, mostly from the U.S. Some of those companies seem willing to go back, like Repsol from Spain, but others like Exxon have said they're not going to go back. It's still too risky.
Being from Calgary and from Edmonton, we know how important the oil and gas industry to the economy of Canada and to the supply for the world. You mentioned in your opening remarks, that we should speed up additional pipelines to the West Coast. Can you elaborate on that further, please?
Look, I mean, that's a complex set of factors around the decision for the West Coast pipeline. I do agree that it should have some form of carbon pricing linked, and it should have indigenous support. But the market case of the pipeline is quite strong at the moment, both on the supply side in terms of the disruptions from other traditional heavy oil suppliers like Venezuela and Mexico, and on the demand side, specifically the construction of these complex refineries in China and India that can process our heavy oil. So those two factors together, I think, are along with the uncertainties in the relationship with the U.S., all support, in my view, more access to the West Coast.
Who's the ethical oil in the world, in Alberta and in Canada? And if you care to please, just a comparison between the oil produced in Venezuela versus the oil produced in Alberta, I think that will be beneficial too. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that they're both, from a technical perspective, both what we call extra heavy oil, meaning that the density is very low, meaning that there's also a lot of sulfur in the oil, so that requires some additional processing. Refiners like those types of barrels because they tend to be cheaper than the sort of light sweet oils that constitute the major benchmarks for the oil market. So a lot of refinery capacity was built first in the U.S. and then in Asia to process those types of barrels. So technically, they're very similar below ground. Above ground, of course, Canada's a much more stable environment. Our companies are doing a great job developing the resource here. We're slowly lowering the greenhouse gas intensity of emissions. We're slowly developing indigenous partnerships. Whereas obviously, as we've been discussing, there's still a lot of uncertainty about the political climate in Venezuela and the capacity of the industry to get back to where they were 20 years ago.
Just final question. We heard that some of the oil were going to China, was going as low as $20 a barrel. Do we have any background to that?
Yes, that really reflected two things. First, Venezuela made some very large loans to China made some very large loans to the Venezuelans 15 years ago or so, where the loans were repaid with oil at a heavy discount. That was further exacerbated by U.S. sanctions that limited kind of the competition for China. Right, it took away the ability of most U.S. refiners and most European refiners to buy that oil. So that gave China a lot of leverage with Venezuela and led to those very favorable prices that they got.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Next, we go to Rob Oliphant. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thank to all our witnesses for sharing wisdom and thoughts with us today. I want to get into some of the politics of this period of transition. And I think there has been pretty much among our like-minded consensus that the presidential elections of 2024 were illegitimate, and that we have agreed with that with the non-recognition of the Maduro presidency. The 2025 parliamentary elections, a little bit more complicated because the opposition really barely participated, with some 84% of the ruling party coalition gaining the parliament. Yet now we have the longtime vice president, acting president. Her brother is the president of the National Assembly. And this week we had a law passed at their National Assembly with respect to mining, opening it up to private interests, totally unheard of in the previous regime. And I'm trying to understand how the leopard changes its spots for the benefit of the Venezuelan people. Because I'm trying to understand how in this period of transition, that is not going to be simply an ability for outsiders to gain access to critical minerals, gold, other assets that should belong to the Venezuelan people. And I'm just trying to understand the nature of this transitional government and whether there is the potential for abuse and that the Venezuelan people actually do not get any advantage. And I think I'd like Ms. Dickinson and maybe Mr. DiMartino to comment on that. Thank you.
Daniel, do you want to maybe start?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. Well, what I would say is the greatest risk actually is that they might legalize the investment from the foreign companies, but then they probably won't come, right? Because mining, oil extraction are all long-run investments. Right now, all these companies only have a guarantee that their assets won't be expropriated, criminal groups will target them, as long as the Trump administration is in power, because nobody credibly believes that a future administration will use force against the Venezuelan regime like they did on January 3rd. That is the only thing that is incentivizing this transition. This is important to understand. This is not happening because the regime wants private investment. This is happening because the regime fears the U.S. government, and therefore the U.S. government asked them to open up for private investment, and so they're doing it. Now, private investors need to make a choice, which is, am I going to recover my investment or not? If you believe that there will be a democratic transition, then yes, you will recover your investment. But if you believe that this transition will lengthen beyond the Trump administration over 3 years, then there is a high risk that you won't recover your investment. And the investment would be very good for the Venezuelan people, by the way, not because of the tax revenues even, but because of just local hiring. In fact, the latest news, and this just came out on I think it's on the Wall Street Journal or Reuters, that they can't find enough oil engineers in Venezuela because all the oil engineers left the country. And so which American or Canadian oil engineer
Shall I go ahead while we wait for him to join again? I think that a critical point here is that the transition that has happened has been an economic opening and very explicitly not a political opening. I think that is the model that the Trump administration has put forward as their immediate term ideal, sort of allowing private enterprise and trade to be reactivated precisely without and directly without this political change. The way that it's been interesting to watch how the Chavista regime has reacted to this operation and to the pressure from the United States. And they've explained it internally in a few ways. The first one is essentially the explanation that they are essentially negotiating with a kidnapper at gunpoint. This idea that they are under so much pressure that the changes they are making are not about their own volition, but rather about survival. I think the other explanation internally, within the regime has essentially been, times have changed. We need to take advantage of the situation. We can do better economically by switching sides and working with the United States. I think there are various levels of a transition. Obviously, the first one is economic, and it's not nothing, particularly if prices stabilize and if families can access basic resources in a way that they have not been able to in many years. We're talking about the price of rice and goods so that families are no longer engaging in coping mechanisms such as eating fewer times a day. Then there's another level of transition, which is, I think, next, civic freedoms. For example, allowing protests, allowing political speech, allowing journalists, the types of protests that we've seen outside of prison facilities from families, asking for the release of political prisoners. That is a slow and gradual step towards civic freedom. And I think the final one would be those political freedoms. We're still very clearly far from that, not just, I think, because Caracas is not interested in that political transition, but also because the U.S. has not asked for it in an explicit way. And I do think that the U.S. pressure will calibrate the speed at which this transition happens.
Thank you very much. We go next.
Apologies, I had some technical issues, but I'm back.
Yes, no problem. We'll come back to you. Just now giving an opportunity to Monsieur Duceppe. 2.5 minutes, please. 1 minute? No, 2.5. Okay.
5 minutes? Oh, 2.5. Pleased to meet you, Mr. Di Martino. Welcome to the committee. I will be speaking French. I wanted to know, and you spoke of Ms. Machado, could you tell the committee whether Leopoldo Lopez will also be participating in political life in Venezuela, in the transformation and the transition to democracy?
I mean, it's his choice. In a free country, I think he should be allowed. I personally, prefer obviously Ms. Machado, and I think he prefers her too and defers to her actually. But of course, he should be free.
Parfait. Merci beaucoup.
Yes, thank you very much. Ms. Halverson, earlier you talked about the contribution of certain countries to your organization, obviously, but I would also like to hear what you have to say about this strange world we live in. Because we can see a number of countries, in particular the Americans, drastically cutting their financing of international assistance and their funding to organizations like yours and USAID, for example. But there are a number of European countries that are doing the same thing. And in its last budget, Canada cut about $2.5 billion out of that money earmarked for aid, and Japan has basically done away with its foreign aid money. And are you worried about that turn of events when it comes to wealthier countries' contribution? Aside from Norway, which is maintaining its percentage of GDP, it really is the exception that confirms the rule. So are you concerned about the trend that is happening worldwide and the impact that it could have on the crisis in Venezuela, for example?
Thank you very much. This is a difficult question to answer quickly. We, of course, have been forced to reduce significantly our field presence, our work, the kinds of services that we are able to provide to persons in human mobility. That's true for the Americas, and it's true for all our operations across the world. So to be very short, the humanitarian work that we do is only possible if it's felt as a commitment by any and everybody who can contribute. So of course we are concerned. We are concerned that there doesn't seem to be the same level of commitment to the humanitarian causes.
Thank you.
And we are, yeah.
Thank you very much. We go next to MP Crump-Nyman. You have 5 minutes.
Perfect. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll start with Mr. Martino. I'd like to thank you for joining today. I think sharing your personal experience after growing up in Venezuela under the Chavez and Maduro governments is interesting, and your perspective is quite welcome for your discussion. Could I ask you to expand on your experiences prior to leaving in 2016?
Yes. So, when I was a kid growing up, it was really a normal childhood in the early 2000s, meaning I went to school, we had a car, we owned our apartment, we had electricity, water, we bought what we needed for food. We went on vacation to Margarita Island, great hotel. I met many foreigners who traveled to Margarita. Maybe Miss Halverson has also been there and visited. I'll say, and then everything changed. Then we started losing power. Then we started having no water for days. And then we had to shower with buckets. Then, of course, going up the stairs, 5 floors, bringing up the food, then lining up for food. Then having to put your fingerprints in a scanning machine so that the government could tell you what you were allowed to purchase and which day of the week you were allowed to purchase it. Because then we ran out. Price controls, hyperinflation, not fitting enough cash. Venezuela might be the only country in the history of the world that had hyperinflation and a shortage of cash at the same time. How do you even have that? Because they printed the money electronically and then there was no cash. So the economy dollarized. And so that was my experience economically.
And can you share what Venezuelans on the ground right now are saying about the removal of Maduro? And in your opinion, do you think that we can expect popular support from Venezuelans to restore the democratic process in Venezuela?
Oh, wow. You had to see my phone the morning after the removal of Maduro. So I have friends that were even in the vicinity of the military bases that were hit. One of my friends, her window broke actually because of the blast. And they were very happy, I can tell you. And everybody was very much ecstatic. Now everybody is just expectant. People want liberty in Venezuela. They want democracy. People, it's a unified country. It's not a country that has ethnic, religious, or language, conflict like in many parts of the world or the Middle East. It's just a country that wants to move on. And they're very grateful for what the United States did. And they're very grateful for all the countries that are supporting us and people around the world.
Thank you, Daniel. My next question would be directed towards Dr. Johnston. Dr. Johnston, in a recent article you have written on...
Mr. Johnston had to leave early, unfortunately, but if you have questions for him, the clerk will forward them to him so that you can get a response.
Sure, I'll pass along the question and then, so I'll move on next to Ms. Halverson. Could you possibly describe the current scale of displacement from Venezuela and how it's affecting other countries in South and Central America?
Unfortunately, we do not have sort of absolute numbers. What I can say is that the trend is more towards people returning than leaving the country. So that means that there are some people who are still going abroad. We hear mainly that Colombia and Brazil are the countries that they try to reach, but we also do know that some people are trying to reach Spain, especially now that the United States has closed the temporary protection scheme that they had. So I'm afraid we do not have absolute numbers to share with you.
Okay, so perhaps you could characterize, or how would you characterize the relationship between
And for those that are watching, the UNHCR, which is the United Nations Commissioner for Refugees, how would you describe the relationship between that and the Maduro regime?
We here in Venezuela, as in any country, work with the states and with whatever government is in place. So in that sense, and I would say, in that sense, and especially at the local level, these service centers that I was talking about in order to provide access to documentation, to psychosocial support, are always organized together with local authorities. So we do build from that. And again, we do really very much want to contribute to a state-led response to the people returning to the country. That's how we can be the most effective.
Thank you very much. Next, we go to MP Stephen Guilbeault. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you to all the witnesses to be here today. I did have a question for Dr. Johnson around what would be needed in terms of investment in Venezuela to ramp up production to what it was. Certainly in light of comments by companies like Exxon saying that the oil sector in Venezuela was uninvestable, quote unquote. But Ms. Dickinson, I have a couple of questions. I mean, you talked about the 3-point plans from the Americans, the third one being a transition to democracy. Can you expand on what would be needed to get there, and is there anything a country like Canada could do to help foster getting to that transition?
This is a great question that I think we're also asking ourselves, sort of what are the conditions that we need? And I think probably the first one really is this fundamental dialogue between the government, the regime, and other sectors of the population. So that's political sectors, the opposition, it's civil society. And I think that is fundamental, because I think one of the keys to making a transition successful, as we've learned in other contexts, are creating conditions that incentivize individuals who are clinging to their posts, particularly if they have committed, for example, human rights abuses. We need to incentivize them to leave their posts, but also to provide justice and truth in a way that is fair to whatever victims they have left in their path. So I think those sorts of conversations are fundamental to have in order to set up the conditions for a successful transition of state control from the hands of one regime into a democratically elected leader. I think that, even before getting to that, there are fundamental steps that this government could continue to take, that they have started taking, and I think could expand dramatically. And the first one that I would point to is civic space. We have seen sort of this push and pull dynamic in the first weeks of this transition. Political prisoners are released, but then they're recaptured. Political prisoners are released, but then new individuals are apprehended. Checkpoints still remain at ad hoc in a way that check people's cell phones to make sure they don't have the wrong information or the wrong communication or a news story that might signal that they are against one side or another. And I think opening up that civic space is really a fundamental first step. And certainly this is a role for the international community to play. I think additionally, the humanitarian side of this is one we rarely think about, but it is a fundamental factor. Just stabilizing daily life in Venezuela for those who have stayed and also for those who potentially return is the fundamentals through which a transition can happen. You have to take care of the sort of step 1, 2, and 3 before we can think about sort of a more dramatic change.
Thank you. How do you think a country like Canada should respond to the recent development in Venezuela, and perhaps more specifically in terms of reopening diplomatic relations with the regime in place?
I think this is a great question, and one that also I think a lot of European countries are grappling with, particularly those who either have maintained embassies or reduced their presence, or who've closed their embassies completely. And our view on this topic is really that it's too early to immediately sort of give the symbolic recognition to this government of reopening fully and bringing sort of diplomatic relations fully online. I think that there is still further to go in terms of the gestures of true goodwill that can be shown from Caracas, and not just sort of the opening opening statements, the announcement of committees, the announcement of laws, but actually their true implementation. It is promising the steps that have been taken, but again, laws like, for example, the amnesty law, waiting to see how that actually unfolds in practice, I think is fundamental to seeing whether this is a commitment that's on paper or it's a commitment that really will play out in the practical consequences for individuals who have been wrongly persecuted for political offenses. So again, our view would be this is a wait and see moment, and also potentially a moment to open a conversation with the government in Caracas about what Canada would like to see in order to reestablish that relationship in terms of that civic opening.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't have any more questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We go next to MP Sandra Covena. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. My questions will be directed to Mr. DiMartino. But before I start, I do want to say we were supposed to have Maria Oropesa joining us today, and I was deeply disappointed when I heard that she wouldn't be able to. As I understand, her headset, she acquired the headset that she was supposed to have, but with the wrong version. And the only difference between one version and the other is comfort for the user. And it is very disappointing because this is somebody who is a political prisoner who was released recently. She still cannot leave the country. She had to travel to another city, as you can imagine, in Venezuela to obtain this. And it's expensive on the ground. And of course, we are doing a study about Venezuela, and we don't have a Venezuelan on the ground. It is very, very disappointing. She's the only Venezuelan who actually has documented the actions of the regime, and in fact, she had live streamed the very moment when she was taken by the regime. So I think I wish we could have done better than that. But
we did, and I don't want to take from your time, but I'm happy to either respond or have the clerk really go into details about.
We can talk about it, but it's just
that we went
to have her silence for a version is.
No,
as
absolutely.
you can understand, disappointing.
It wasn't just about the comfort level of the headset for the user. It was actually the ability of the headset to work with
but
both.
the sound, anyways, I don't want to get into the discussion, but I know that, as I understand, the sound check went through, but we can discuss details just to avoid it in the future. So, Mr. DiMartino, if I may, some Canadians, of course, when they woke up to the news of the removal of Nicolás Maduro, were conflicted about the method that was used for his removal. He was taken into U.S. custody under serious criminal charges, including drug trafficking and direct involvement with terrorist organizations. Could you please give us your perspective on that, on the removal, and perhaps you can touch on the specific criminal charges for which Nicolás Maduro is currently being held in the United States?
Yeah, the truth is that anything that has happened to Maduro is too little for what he truly deserves. So it's amazing that he was taken. It was done in a really great operation. This was really just law enforcement. He was lawfully indicted, unlike Maria Oropesa, as you mentioned, who was kidnapped from her home at night. Maduro got a little bit of his own medicine, except it was all lawful and really positive in the ground, right? Most of the people who died defending him were Cuban agents. I think we don't talk enough about the role that the Cuban regime has in supporting the repression in Venezuela, in addition to repressing its own people.
And of course, we do hear some even members of parliament saying, you know, it is not for anyone else but the Venezuelan people to change the government, and they should do it from with the Venezuelans that are on the ground, even not even the expats having a role to play in that transition. There are some complications, of course, with that, given the current or the Maduro regime. Could you please share your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, number one, we're talking about an armed regime and an unarmed civilian population. The truth is, Venezuela was never going to change without external help. By the way, most countries tend not to change without external help. The Soviet Union didn't fall on its own. It fell thanks to international pressure too. Then, and then they just got lucky too in that they got Gorbachev, somebody who wanted to reform, but it took, 70, 80 years for that to happen. That is a lifetime of many people. It's hundreds of thousands of deaths. It's millions of refugees. It's something that is affecting the world. You mentioned the charges. Maduro himself was a drug trafficker. His nephews, or really the biological nephews of his wife, Celia, were convicted in the United States of them being drug traffickers, bringing cocaine to the United States. That cocaine also ends up in Canada. It kills Canadian citizens. That is a national security issue. And he's not being even indicted of the crimes he committed against Venezuelans in Venezuela, which have been the worst of the crimes.
And experts have suggested that Venezuela served as a platform for Iranian influence in the Western Hemisphere and may have hosted networks linked to the IRGC and Hezbollah. What type of activities were these groups believed to conduct inside Venezuela?
Well, one thing is modern terrorist groups finance themselves through drug trafficking. The Taliban financed themselves through opium, right? So did the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad. And so do the Venezuelans, so does FARC, so does ELN. And so that is something to keep in mind. The IRGC is one of those groups. The Iranians not only function in Venezuela, but we're seeing Islamic Shia schools open in Margarita and in other parts of Venezuela. And look, I have nothing against people who are believers of Islam, but these are people immigrating to Venezuela from Iran. Who is trying to immigrate? Which kind of foreigner wants to immigrate to Venezuela in its current state? Only somebody sponsored by a foreign regime.
Thank you very much. I understand there's agreement to allow me to ask a few questions because we have a slot. I just wanted to follow up on some of the questions that have already been asked. On Venezuela, the idea of a transition was supposed to lead to democracy. What is the momentum towards that? And I would like to hear from Ms. Dickinson as well as Mr. Martino.
You can
Sure,
go ahead,
I think,
Elizabeth.
Sure. I think, in terms of the U.S. government position, as we have heard it publicly articulated and as well as our private conversations, is essentially to, I think, to say that we are not ready to have that conversation yet. So I would say that the momentum is very far in the offing, unfortunately, at least from the U.S. perspective. I think, as we've heard throughout this hearing, on the ground, Venezuelans themselves, I think, are itching for this opening in the form that is possible to come. And in fact, recent polling shows that Maria Corina Machado continues to be by far the overwhelmingly most popular politician in the country. So I think here, we have almost a replay of tensions that Venezuela has experienced now for years, in which you have tension between a regime now supported and in alliance with the United States that is very reluctant to relax its clench on power. And I think to have these conversations about a democratic transition, in tension, I think, with the sort of growing calls for it from the people themselves.
What I would say is governments are not a sole entity. The U.S. government is not even a sole entity on itself. There's people with different opinions, and there's different goals, right, that different people have in mind. And so the question at the end of the day is, who is going to win? Who is going to win? And I think a lot of the things you see in the media, unfortunately, are also just planted. Why do you think that in December, a month before the U.S. intervention, the New York Times put on its cover, Delcy Rodriguez tried to whitewash her? Do you think that was coincidental? I don't think so. Do you think it's coincidental how many journalists and people are trying to twist different words that the president or the Secretary of State say? I don't think any of that is coincidental. I think that the regime has been trying to remain in power for a very long time. They have many different paid actors around the world, especially in developed countries. And their goal is to lengthen this transition process. Economically, the only way the US, Canada, Europe, the world is going to reap the benefits of economic liberalization is through the rule of law, right? Venezuela.
That's actually where I was going next. Speaking of rule of law, how do the neighboring countries feel about the manner in which the removal of Maduro happened. I know colleagues, of course, have a lot of reservations about the Maduro regime and his methods and his repression of the Venezuelan people. I share that, but at the same time, we have rules for a reason. We have international law. We have authorization that is needed from the UN and others. How do the neighboring countries, Brazil, Colombia, and others, feel about the fact that there was an operation launched without any consultation or authorization by the United Nations or neighboring countries?
I can speak to that. So certainly, I think, as you said, very similar to your sentiments, no one was sorry to see the back of Maduro. I think he had a very frustrating, tense relationship with many of his neighbors. Having said that, the operation absolutely sent a chilling message through the region about the U.S. willingness to use force, including the full force of the U.S. military, to achieve its own political objectives in the region. And I think that has caused quite a bit of anxiety in neighboring states. It has certainly silenced, I think, some of the criticism of the United States that regional states have had on a range of issues, and I think a deep concern about what this style of U.S. influence means for the region going forward, particularly at a moment when 3 key countries are set to have elections in the coming year. That's Colombia, Brazil, and Peru.
So I disagree on that. It sent a chilling effect as universally. I think it sent a chilling effect to the enemies of the West. I think it sent a chilling effect to criminals like the president of Colombia himself, Petro, who's a former M19 terrorist member, same as Lula, convicted, corrupt leader. I think it was very much welcomed, as you see from public statements by the president of Argentina, the now president since today of Chile, same even the Peruvian government, the Ecuadorian government, the Dominican Republic itself. So I think this is really a division between the countries that support the rule of law and freedom and the countries that don't, or governed by people who don't.
Okay. Before I pass the mic over to Monsieur Duceppe, I just want to, for the sake of balance, mention that Mr. Lula was acquitted by a court of law and Mr. Bolsonaro was actually convicted of trying to overthrow a democratically elected government in Brazil out of fairness. Monsieur Duceppe, 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Yes. And there are some other U.S. interventions in the past, in Pinochet's Chile, or in Argentina in the 60s and 70s, in Paraguay. There have been a number of U.S. operations that were not necessarily compliant with international law. There's Operation Condor as well. That is very well known and well documented. But I think that what is important to me is whether it goes against international law or not. What actually I want to know is what people in Venezuela reacted to Mr. Maduro's removal. Because, and I think it's pretty obvious around this table at least, that Mr. Maduro was oppressing his own people. So maybe Ms. Dickinson and then Mr. DiMartino, afterwards you could answer that question. And also when it comes to the transition toward a lasting democracy, what are the prospects there? Because it is important to have that lasting nature. So Ms. Dickinson and then Mr. DiMartino, please.
Sure. So the polling has shown, again, that the operation was overwhelmingly popular among Venezuelans, both at home and abroad. And I think that reflects very much the sentiment that Venezuelans held with regard to his government, and particularly the high levels of repression that were used at incremental levels, rising really since the 2024 elections that Maduro incorrectly claimed that he had won. So I think that certainly the immediate impact has been support broadly for that opposition. Look, I mean, I think in terms of the transition, Venezuela has been waiting for a transition for a very, very long time, and I think one of the reasons we reached this moment was essentially that the opposition tried everything. They tried boycotting elections. They tried standing in elections. They tried seeking U.S. support in organizing free and fair elections, which they won, but then were not recognized. And so I do think that there's a level of exasperation in the Venezuelan political opposition with this sort of these slow transitions. And I do think that this will be a tension going forward. And I think one of the fundamental reasons that we really believe that this political dialogue is urgent between the government and all sectors.
I think you got to the question of at the heart of the matter here, which is this is not even about international law. This is about whether what's just and what's right. Removing Maduro was just and right. It was even done in a very just and right way, I would add. So the question going forward on the transition is really, does the United States put the choice to the remnants of the regime? It's either you risk your life because we will intervene militarily, and this time it won't be an arrest. It will be similar to what we're doing in Iran. Or you give him power democratically, you keep all your stolen money, and you go live in a different country, perhaps Qatar or whichever will welcome you, and live the rest of your days there. Because the truth is, whether we have a dialogue or not, dialogues have happened for 27 years. They continue to fail because there's no leverage, right? The opposition has no leverage. The only leverage was military action. It happened. Now the U.S. has the leverage. And what happens next will be whatever the U.S. is willing to impose on the Venezuelan regime. The Venezuelan regime might say no, but I think that now there's a credible threat of the use of military force, and they clearly have no way to resist. All the anti-air equipment that Venezuela had was destroyed on January 3rd. And so there's really no way for them to resist if the United States wants to pressure for something.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the witnesses for your appearance before the committee today and for your remarks and your testimony. We really appreciate it.